How much more wine do we have?
More than enough.
It should last us.
Yeah. Ahoy hoy, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk. I'm Sean Polidano, the terrible influence that your parents warned you about, and joining me today to talk everything about Formula One is my favourite ginger, Aaron Best. How are you today?
Well, I have finally convinced you to let me have a glass of wine while we record, so I am wonderful.
Hey, cheers! How wonderful. I did want to make sure, though, that the first couple of episodes was somewhat professional. But yes, why not have a bit of a drink? We're hit our third now, so why not? That said, we should probably preface this episode with the fact that we are both a little worse for wear after a wonderful weekend at Gaytimes.
Yes, for those that don't know, Gaytimes is an annual gay camping festival held east of Melbourne. It is a fantastic community-run event, and we had an amazing time with lots of amazing people.
How many costume changes did you go through, Aaron?
On Saturday, 8. 8 costume changes on Saturday, I think 2 on Friday, and I only had 1 outfit for Sunday.
Okay, what was your most favourite outfit choice whilst I got you on this conversation?
I actually really liked my Sunday outfit. It was very cute. It was the overalls with the pink bandana and the pearls. Yeah, it came together quite well.
It was giving country church, basically. Now, we are definitely paying for it this week, but let's get into a big week of Formula One. With the teams now getting onto track for the first time to test their cars in Bahrain, we also have the drop of the new season of Drive to Survive on Netflix. So not only do we have a glimpse into how each team may perform this year, we also have a much clearer view on what happened off track last year.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see how the Drive to Survive season unfolded with the stories that they told from last season. Today, we are going to discuss a few of the storylines that they focused on and what we think will be their implications on this year's team dynamics. It goes without saying that there are going to be spoilers ahead. So if you are yet to watch the new season of Drive to Survive and don't want to hear what happens, pause now and come back once you've watched it through.
So Aaron, where should we start with this season of Drive to Survive?
Well, the season opener focused on the off-season. So you got to see how the boys were behaving during off-season, and it was really interesting to see there were kind of 2 different styles. There was the Lando Norris from McLaren, who was very carefree. I wake up when I want, I eat junk food, I do what I want, I'm just having a good time. And then you had, even within his own team, Zach Brown, his team principal, or Max Verstappen at Red Bull, were talking about how the off-season was just, they got itchy feet and they just wanted to do stuff. They felt like the off-season went for too long. They wanted to get back to working.
Yeah, I wonder how much like the winter and the cold actually plays into that too, going, I'm now mulling around here when I could actually be tinkering with the car.
Yeah, like we have their break over summer, but for them it is winters. Unless they come to Australia and spend the summer here, they're stuck inside.
Which, funnily enough, I think Bottas actually travels down to Australia now again, right? Especially with that mullet that he had last year.
And that was literally his only engagement through the entire season of Drive to Survive, was they talked about the haircut that he got over the off season. It was his only interview. He really enjoyed his mullet, and that was the only time he was mentioned.
There we go, Netflix. Netflix finally has a mullet.
Their first storyline was a lot about Aston Martin, in particular, Lawrence Stroll, and the winning attitude he has in everything that he does. He's a very savvy businessman. He's a very wealthy businessman, a very important person. They made a really big point of making sure that he was really important during the episode.
Yeah, it was very interesting to see the dynamic of Daddy Stroll. I'm going to call him that because, again, he just exudes his presence. Also on my daddy radar would be Toto Wolff. And it was very interesting that first episode while I was watching it with you was the comparative nature on who got a wristband and who didn't, right? Everyone was like panicking for the fact that Lawrence Stroll was arriving on the boat, that he did not want a wristband at all. And then when Toto comes on through, they give him a wristband and just usher him on the way. Again, he must just draw this kind of big, grand, kind of scary figure with anyone that he's kind of working with.
Also interesting, during that party where Toto was treated as just a guest while Lawrence was clearly an important person, during Lawrence's speech, you saw how nervous Lance was. It was really interesting. They then had a bit more of a story about Lance, and Lance hurting himself at the start of last season, pushing himself really hard to get back in the car for the first Grand Prix and first qualifying. And you kind of saw exactly how much pressure he is under to perform, not just for his team, but for his dad's team. That the drive to do well for his dad is clearly something that is very big for him.
What would you rather have? Your dad that owns the team and having that pressure down? Or would you want that father figure that has been your hero and that has got you to racing but is maybe off the side? Like, what is that kind of pressure then looking like? Which one would you actually want?
I don't think I would want my dad to be the owner of the team. Like, to have your dad as your boss, I think there's just too much. I don't think you could ever really get to a proper professional relationship with having the father-son relationship have some sort of overarching impact on that.
But he can definitely be my daddy.
We also saw a little bit about Mercedes in this first episode, particularly because Aston Martin came out of the gates powering and they did so well. Mercedes thought that they were going to do well this year and they just underperformed, particularly next to Aston Martin. And you just watched it kind of break Toto in that first race.
Yeah, I think the biggest part with that is Aston Martin is using a Mercedes engine, right? So Mercedes is an engine supplier. And to then automatically see that Aston has just jumped far ahead with what they've done from an aero package perspective, just ruffled a lot of feathers within that Mercedes team to be like, we've not got this package correct. And it was a little bit of a what the hell moment.
It was interesting that this was kind of really all we got to see from Aston Martin throughout the season for Drive to Survive. We know that over the course of the season, their performance started to wane, particularly as other teams got upgrade packages like McLaren and started to overtake them. They didn't really cover off the losses that Aston Martin started to suffer towards the end of the season until kind of the very last episode where they were wrapping up where are they going to land in the Constructors' Championship. And they started to really kind of compare them to McLaren and how McLaren had an upward trajectory and Aston had a downward trajectory over the course of the season. But they really focused on that dynamic of Lawrence Stroll and how important he is and how much kind of pressure he puts on people like Lance because he needs to perform for his dad.
Yeah, I wonder if that was part of him actually signing up to be part of Netflix for this series.
He also was the only one who didn't have to go to a Netflix studio for his confessionals. They went to his office.
Come on, Daddy.
Our next and this is probably one of our biggest themes or biggest stories and narratives for the season, was the story of Red Bull, AlphaTauri, Christian Horner, Daniel Ricciardo, Nick De Vries, and Liam Lawson. They spent a number of episodes talking about this group of people, and it was very interesting to see the people dynamic in this paradigm. We get at the start a bit of a cringy moment where Santa is in the Horner household and asks the kids whether or not Daddy's been good this year.
There is so much in this Netflix series that has not aged well, and that was definitely one of them. I think I squeaked and squawked when that point came up and just looked at you going,
But the actual reason that they had this kind of familial moment with Christian Horner was to set up the opportunity for his kids to ask him who his favorite driver is and for him to say Daniel Ricciardo. And they really set up that place that Daniel holds in Christian's heart and how much Christian is going to go into bat for him. And we saw that throughout the season, where Christian clearly had such a big finger in the AlphaTauri pie, and he did the most to try and do right by Daniel in particular.
Which is a very interesting thing, especially being like Christian Horner. He could have anyone at his disposal, whether that is through the junior team and that development from F2 onwards in that Red Bull team structure. Why Daniel Ricciardo? Like, is this a genuine soft spot, do you reckon? Or is it just that he's the best thing at the moment and he just wants him to have that seat?
I think it was a little bit of a here's the one that got away moment for Christian. He was a great performer and Christian had done so much to get him to where he was. And then for him to turn around and go, well, I'm leaving home. I think it just cut emotionally into Christian's state, and the opportunity to bring him back into the family, I think, was just something that he had to do emotionally.
I think for me, that was also quite interesting and again showcases maybe a different type of power that Christian Horner has as a team boss and principal, was the fact that he was able to go and talk to the new CEO from AlphaTauri at that time and be like, well, I've got a proposal for you. I think you should go and bring Daniel in. Let's have a conversation. Again, this is in front of Netflix. There was probably another conversation that was done previous to this before it was ready to be on air. But again, it just very much looked like it was a Christian Horner show across both of those teams.
And at that time, we obviously then started to see the story of Nick De Vries unfold. And we saw this kind of very kill or be killed mentality within the Red Bull AlphaTauri teams really start to play out. And they had interviews of Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly, two former team members, speak out saying that it is really sink or swim. If you don't survive, you are gone. And we started to see over the course of the season, Nick's killer instinct just wasn't there, or the losses that he was suffering just battered his confidence to the point where in Monaco, he was talking about, my strategy is just finish the race, hope that other people in front of me don't, so that I get their positions. And that's not the attitude that you should really have when realistically we constantly hear push, push, push for these drivers as their strategy.
Yeah, and especially like when I see a Formula One driver, yes, of course, they're going to be charismatic. They're going to be engaging. They're going to be likable. But the ones that win, they're hard. They attack. They're not defending, right? I think of Alonso and all his championships in terms of what he even did with those cars. Hamilton is a fighter, right? He attacks constantly. Schumacher, a fighter. So again, it was kind of a bit heartbreaking to see a bit more of that emotion, or maybe, I don't know whether it's emotion, but to just see that kind of thought mentality that came through Nick de Reeves. Do you reckon it was just lack of confidence?
I think it was the losses that he suffered shot his confidence to hell. And once he missed that moment, it was gone. I think he came in with these high expectations, as we saw. He came in expecting that he was going to be the number one driver and that Yuki was going to be second. And that's not what happened. And I think that just played on his mind to the point where he did just start to give up. And when that happened, he had nowhere to go. So his season ended.
Yeah. Now, again, his season ended for Daniel Ricciardo to come on through, but Daniel was only in the car for a couple of races until he injured his wrist. And then you then had to bring in a new driver.
And speaking of rookies coming in and being the number one driver, Lawson came in, and of, I think it was 5 races that he raced with Yuki, he outperformed Yuki in all but one of them. That's
impressive.
It is. It's a big thing for him to have performed so well. And I think the story that we see with Lawson, and it's a really kind of touching. They go really cutesy with his story. They show his family. They show how much it means to him. They show that he comes from that lower socioeconomic background. They talk about the fact that he grew up in New Zealand and his dad for his entire life promised him that one day they would go to the Singapore Grand Prix, and they never did. And in actual fact, he took his dad to the Singapore Grand Prix and he was driving in it. So they had a really big emotional tie to Liam Lawson, and I find it really interesting that Netflix decided to do that.
Oh, it pulled on my heartstrings. Already starting to get a little bit teary about that story too, because again, that kind of, not pressure, but that kind of, you're wanting to achieve that dream that you had. It's not only your dream, it could also then be your family's there too. And to flip that and for Liam to take his family to Singapore for that first race that he did, it was very heartwarming.
And like I said, it's an interesting angle for Netflix to take. I think that's going to do a lot for Liam's reputation. Even though he doesn't have a seat for 2024, I think that he's going to be really popular thanks to that episode of Drive to Survive. And I wouldn't be surprised if that works so well in his favour over the course of this year and into 2025.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Hopefully we get to see him back on the grid. He's a great driver, and that really showed in that 2023 season.
Our next storyline that they covered off, and this was a really interesting one, McLaren. So at the very start of the season, we saw Zach Brown, the team principal of McLaren, being sat down with the CEO of McLaren and being asked, look, you've changed up your driver lineup. You've told me that Daniel was the problem and you've gotten rid of Daniel. Now you need to perform. And there was just this very you've used your scapegoat now. You've got no excuses left. If you can't perform, what the fuck are you doing?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with Zach Brown as an individual and as a person is you don't know where he is in terms of his, is he conniving? Is he telling the truth? Is he just trying to lead people on? And you could definitely see that in some of the shots and the meetings, with these sponsors, was very interesting going, you've told us that you're going to achieve this and we've not seen it.
Yeah, to see the way he interacted with senior executives from Google, from Android, and from OKX, their 3 biggest sponsors, and to watch him wiggle his way out of that snake's pit, but also seeing the way he interacted with Lando was really interesting. We saw a little bit of a background to their relationship. They've known each other for 8 years now, since Lando was a child when he was 14. And some of the interactions with Lando and Zach give you an idea on why Lando has signed another extended contract with McLaren.
I think there are two parts to that in my thoughts. The car performed well. Finally, Zach delivered on that promise, which allowed Lando to go, you know what, I will stick through. And of course, there is that emotional connection. You know, after 8 years working together, building that career for the both of themselves, you know, it's a big thing. But again, I just don't know where to sit with it. I just feel like it's always on this kind of, do I trust him? Is it on a knife edge situation with Zach? Because I just don't know if it's always true.
There was just something about the way he interacted with people that just felt disingenuous. And I don't know whether it was the way that Netflix have framed him in their series, because this isn't the first time that these kind of things are being talked about with him, that he is a bit of a smiling assassin in the Formula One world, that he will tell you one thing and do something else behind your back, and those kinds of stories flow around and allegations flow around. So it's interesting to kind of see him and the way he interacts with his team. And it was also interesting to see in one of their very first meetings on the day of their car launch to see the interaction between Lando and Oscar. Lando made a specific point to arrive to the event early so that he was there before Oscar. He then made sure to point that out, that he was there before Oscar. When Oscar was then having photos and stuff taken, he was taking small little jabs at, oh, well, he looks little, but he's a little bit tall, isn't he? He was taking those kind of opportunities to make little playful jabs. And I don't know how much of that was him feeling threatened by this new kid.
Yeah, I wonder if he just took the Ricciardo way of being funny, and that's now his slight personality, because he is pretty cheeky. I kind of like it. But again, is it more the fact that he's now the veteran of the team and he is now dealing with a very capable rookie? And we definitely saw that in the 2023 season.
Speaking of veterans, the next big storyline that they kind of told was of Haas. And the change in direction that Haas and Gunther Steiner took, with the fact that they did 2 rookies with Mazepin and Schumacher. It didn't work out well for them.
Nope.
They've now gone to a much more stable driver lineup of 2 veterans in Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen. And they then made a point to juxtapose the Haas dynamic and the Haas team leadership style of Gunther to Williams and the leadership style of their new team principal, James Volz, and his fairly not rookie lineup of Alex Albon and Logan Sargent.
It's just youth.
They're just a younger lineup. To see the different ways that they have approached being a team principal and the way they treat their teams, and just every chance they got, they showed Gunther swearing.
But he's known for that. That's his personality, right? But yes, you got the polar opposite with James being so analytical and focused, methodical, but also I think encouraging. I think that was the biggest thing for me. Like, he brought the team in, it was looking at the data. How are you feeling about this? What's your thoughts? Here are mine. Where you got the opposite side was always Gunther always going to the phone call with Gene going, it's beep, it's this, it's stupid, it's not working. And it just was that polar opposite kind of thing and experience.
And they did spend a lot of this season building up that stress on Gunther and showing how much it's starting to wear on him.
Yeah.
You saw a really cute conversation between him and the former team principal at Ferrari, Binotto. They both are close friends. They've both been in episodes of Drive to Survive together, spending a lot of time together, and they obviously have a really good friendship. And to watch Binotto kind of talk to Gunther about leaving the paddock and what it's meant for him obviously does set up a lot of what we've seen this year with Gunther leaving. Towards the end of the season, they showed the struggle that Gunther had, ending in last place again. They set up, even though they showed that it was very tense for Gunther, they did set up what we saw, which was him leave the paddock this year.
Yeah. I think I've got like 2 more bits with this whole Haas and Williams thing that I like to bring up. Number 1, I'm glad Hülkenberg's back. He's hot. I've always thought he was hot. Loved him in Renault. Number 2, I'm loving the data approach that James Vowles is giving. It's very interesting to see him come on board. He's not a traditional team principal. And you also had the previous owner of Williams, Claire Williams, talking about that. And I thought it was just a really nice opportunity to kind of see someone that is such an engineering background that loves these cars at that molecular level come in and own that team.
And even just down to, he's clearly not a normal man. I only have caffeine on Sundays because if I have caffeine any other day of the week, then it will no longer have an effect and I'll need caffeine to get to normal, which is what's happening to you. And he points at one of his engineers. And so he's like, I will only have teas or waters and then I will save caffeine for my Sundays so that I can have that to pep me up. And then they contrasted that with Toto walking in going, I'll have a cappuccino pumpernickel. Which I really want to know what that is.
Yeah, maybe we just need to try it as one of the drinks of the episodes.
The next big thing that they discussed throughout the season was very much this kind of, they didn't directly pit the two teams against each other, but they did show quite a difference in the structure of Alpine versus the structure of Ferrari. We had two teams that had very interesting dynamics within their drivers. So you had Sainz and Leclerc, who were obviously really competitive, and then you had Ocon and Gasly, who not only are very competitive, have a really, really up and down past that they had to try and overcome in order to be teammates, going back to their karting days when they used to go-kart together. And Gasly overtook Ocon for a race win, but he did it in the wrong way. Gasly was eventually disqualified. However, just the fact that he drove a little bit dirty to get around Ocon tarnished their relationship quite a lot. It hasn't recovered, and it clearly hadn't recovered, as we saw in the way that they were behaving with each other throughout last season and the way they were driving against each other, particularly with events like in Melbourne where they had the huge crash, the two of them, just because they got too close to each other. We saw the way that Fred Vasseur was handling the Ferrari boys and how he handled their off-track and on-track squabbles. And then we had the way that Otmar was really trying unsuccessfully to manage Ocon and Gasly. And eventually we saw Otmar be removed from his team principal position because the team just wasn't performing.
Yeah, I think the whole Alpine thing is very interesting overall. I think it comes back to pride. I think it comes back down to what the manufacturer is wanting, so the parent company Renault, and their goals and what's being sold potentially to them or what they're wanting to get out of it. And yeah, Otmar was not managing that team, especially when you are getting drivers pitting themselves at one another. It's not going to encourage the team to move forward in those standings to get more money and get more sponsorships. It's just going to cause heartbreak and disaster.
And one of the things that the way that Netflix structured the episodes about each of those teams is really that there was just this overarching feel of amateurishness around the way that Alpine were being handled, the way they were behaving. Just the whole team just felt amateur hour. Whereas you had Ferrari and the way Fred was handling his team, he was a charismatic guy. He was a little bit of fun. He enjoyed what he was doing, but he still was just so professional and he clearly was doing the right thing. Like after we had Leclerc and Sainz going at each other in a race in a way that they shouldn't have been doing, Fred sat them both down over dinner and he told them straight, pull your head in. This is not how you're supposed to race. They both agreed. And the next race that we see, they both act like a team. And Charles did what he needed to do to make sure that Sainz could get into the position to win that Grand Prix in Singapore.
Yeah. I did find the pacing and how the episodes were laid out for the whole Alpine conversation or theme to be a little bit weird. Like we had the one episode of building it all up. We then had to wait until another 2 episodes before that kind of got resolved, and that felt pretty much resolved or felt it could have been in that first episode there. I did find it was a weird like playing thing with Netflix, but again, I think it was just so that I could kind of draw more connections back to this Ferrari story there on how things are different. But yeah, I just don't feel like it needed to go over for 2 episodes. It could have just been solved under one.
Yeah, that first Alpine episode that they had where they were talking particularly about the dynamic between Ocon and Gasly and the bad blood between them, the episode just ended and it didn't feel like it went anywhere. It was very anticlimactic, and it wasn't until a few episodes later where we finally got to see some sort of resolution, but it still just fell flat compared to some of the other storylines that they've told during the season. The final storyline that I found one of the most interesting was that of Mercedes, Toto, and Lewis Hamilton.
This one was interesting, actually. I think the dynamic and how it was starting to shift between Lewis and Toto. You know, they've been doing this now for 10 or so years, have won so many championships, and now the car is just not working. And Lewis is asking for answers in terms of what can be done. Here are some suggestions, and it not coming through. It's just showing this kind of now divide between what I thought were two, you know, very united, strong individuals to the end.
I think you just saw this disenfranchisement from Lewis, this I'm too old for this shit attitude coming through, even in some of their promotional stuff. He kind of openly kind of admitted, I'm just racing for my 8th. If he gets the 8th, he'll retire tomorrow. But just the way he clearly has lost faith in Mercedes, it was obvious.
It was obvious, but to then go and sign the contract for that year, again, this is one of those other moments where you go, well, this has aged terribly, especially with the news of him now going to Ferrari in 2025. Like, that was interesting to then see.
You do wonder what changed. Was it literally just, you know what, he signed it back in August and the end of the season just didn't instill any confidence in him? He was saying things that they needed to improve in the car, and the engineers were turning around going, no, you don't know. You don't know what you're talking about. And then them having to come back to him later and go, oh, yes, actually, we're doing what you said we should do. That final race of the season, just before they get in the car and there's him and Toto talking to each other, Toto makes the joke saying like, oh, this is the last time you have to see this car. And Hamilton almost didn't take it as a joke. It kind of went with a, yeah, thank fuck kind of mentality. Like, if I ever see it again, it's too soon.
Yeah.
I think it was very much that there's no love lost between Hamilton and Mercedes, unfortunately. It will be interesting to see how Mercedes structure this season, because if they don't pull their finger out and perform well this season, that mentality, that disenfranchisement that Lewis is feeling could spread amongst their team, and worse, could spread to Russell and his garage as well. That could do untold damage to their future.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm very much looking forward to on how Netflix brings out the 2024 version of it and seeing more on Russell. The conversation and the storyline was very much between Toto and Lewis in this shift. Like, what's now going to be the pressure on Russell in 2024? I'm very much looking forward to that as a subject in the new season next year.
Before we move on to what we've seen this year in testing and what we're hopefully going to see from the teams in this year's season, I just wanted to touch on a couple of the themes from Drive to Survive that I found really interesting, that I really enjoyed. The first was getting to have Claire Williams, as you mentioned before, back and having her offer that kind of view of team principles, which was something that the season really focused on. We saw a lot of the team principles this year, the stresses that they're under, the pressure that they're under, and how much work they actually put into making sure their drivers are happy, making sure the garages are happy, making sure their sponsors are happy, making sure their CEO is happy. This season was a lot about the team principles.
Yeah, which for me, I'm loving this new side to see. You know, growing up, it was always falling in love with the drivers and the car itself. It was never the people behind the scenes that make it all work. To now see the narrative, the stories, the pain, especially like with Gunther going through this again and feeling very disenfranchised by the end of it. I think it's a beautiful touch that Netflix has been able to go and add to F1 by adding a bit more of that kind of team principle voice. I would love to now see strategists in the future, or maybe even some of the mechanics back at home.
We also, as previous seasons, we had Will Buxton, Formula One journalist, helping to keep the narrative moving for Drive to Survive. This year, we also had Danica Patrick, who is a former IndyCar racer, and it was really great to have not only a driver come in and talk to the driver's perspective, but also have a female driver and have both Claire and Danica offer some really strong female voices and opinions on the season.
I thought it was actually wonderful to see. Again, for me, it was Claire. I think that experience, especially with her family being under the Williams name, it was just really nice to see. And and to add a little bit of that kind of colour to the story.
It also is interesting. I wonder whether or not Danica's participation in Drive to Survive and the popularity of Drive to Survive will make a difference to representation within Formula One.
I hope so.
As we discussed while we were watching it, I had a look. There literally is no rule that says you have to be a man to participate in Formula One. The reason that we have a mostly male team is that female drivers struggle to get the sponsorships to secure themselves a seat. So I wonder whether Danica's participation in Drive to Survive will have an impact on the paddock moving forward. The final thing that I found interesting was more of a lack of what we saw. So as we mentioned earlier, we only had Bottas appear once. We did not have Zhou appear at all. There was no real storylines that talked about Alfa Romeo at all. And we also didn't have Max. There were 2 very brief confessionals of Max's where he didn't talk anything specific about the season. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they were pre-records from a previous season that Netflix decided to use.
Yeah, I do think that he is not wanting to be part of the whole media circus of it all, and he's got a right to say that. He is a championship driver. He wants to focus on the driving. Did we need to learn anything about 2023 from his end? No, probably not. That's where not all the drama was. So I don't think it was going to add anything anyway.
So that brings us up to this year and last week's Formula One testing.
So yeah, testing was completed over 3 days at the Bahrain International Circuit. The thing that we have to preface here is that it's testing, right? I think we're going to see a lot more of what are these cars capable of in the race this weekend. But I think the great thing about seeing with testing and what we kind of learned from it was to actually see these cars in all their glory, especially when we were talking about those car launches last week about where we couldn't see much of the side skirts of some of these cars. We actually got to see a lot of that this week from testing.
And we also know that there are a lot of teams, and it's often a talking point, is that in testing, a lot of teams will do stuff that is there to misdirect. Like they might not push as hard. They might not go for their fastest times. They might not put in as many laps. They might decide to only do short stints or only do long stints. And that's not just a reflection of what they're expecting to be able to do in the car, but it's also what they want their rivals to see.
Yeah, but ultimately it is a bit of a shakedown, right? It is 3 days to get as much data possible with these cars out on the track. I think it was quite amazing to kind of see some of the imagery of all the additional sensors added to the back of the car or onto the side of the vehicles because they're just trying to get as much data in, but also using paint to then understand on how aero was working too. It's very fabulous to see those kind of elements being used. But now, I won't bore you with the data. There was too much that came out of it, but I think there are 4 things that stood out to me during the testing session. Number 1, Alpine, McLaren and Williams didn't have enough time in the car. Now, based on data that came on through, they were at the back of the mileage of running over the weekend. Williams had issues for the fact that they just were rushing to get their actual car to the track. They had changed so much from the launch spec that we all saw a couple of weeks ago to the car that was then running on track. So we were talking about some rumors that Albon had to change his entire way of driving the car, and that was very much evident and seen because they have changed everything about it. So that's why they didn't run as much. McLaren had issues with Lando. I think there was a fuel pump issue on the first day of testing, which meant he didn't run at all. So that pretty much brought down the mileage of the team. And Alpine just struggled over the weekend with probably not a very competitive car and not enough mileage then put on through to then get some more data, which makes me very concerned for the team this year.
And it is interesting to see that, for example, a lot of the fastest drivers on the weekend were using C4 tyres. So the tyre compounds go from C1, which is our softest tyres, through to C5, which is our hardest tyres. In any given race weekend, you will get 3 of those tyres chosen by Pirelli to be used for that race. But during testing, they have the opportunity to use the tyres that they would like. We had McLaren score their fastest time with a C3 tyre, so a softer tyre, which is generally considered to be faster.
Yeah.
Whereas the rest of the high-end teams, the rest of the teams that performed faster than McLaren, were using C4s. They were using a harder or a medium compound tyre compared to McLaren, and McLaren still weren't there. So we know that McLaren have this issue of limping through the gate and performing better towards the middle of the season. I wonder whether we'll see that again.
Yeah, and I don't think this is a misdirect, unlike what we'll get to, I think, with Red Bull. I think this is just maybe some general niggles that they haven't really worked out with on that McLaren car, and hopefully they'll kind of get that now sorted for the weekend's Grand Prix. Another point that I kind of picked out was the fact that these fastest times came from Sainz at Ferrari, Russell at Mercedes, and Joe at Sauber. Joe and Russell were like a minute 30 for their lap, which was quite quick. And then Ferrari came out the guns with a minute 29. Again, ran on that C4 tyre that you told about. Very interesting that you didn't see anything that was like a Red Bull, especially with the package that they've got there too.
And we've discussed this, like Red Bull have changed quite a lot on their car. Red Bull are taking a lot more risks with the design of their car this year. We assume that they know what they're doing and that they're hoping that it's going to perform, but this could be that it is reflective of what's going to happen, but I highly doubt that. I reckon that they went, you know what, take it easy out there, don't push, just get used to the car, get familiar with the track. We're not out here to break records in testing.
Yeah, I think they were on like cruising mode the entire weekend, just taking it very much easy. There's also rumors they were using some fans or companies were using some sort of GPS data to understand the engine mapping and what was then kind of completed for these cars, and that Red Bull was very much in the lowest engine map. So they were very much just going, free, we're just doing whatever we want. Just get the data in and see what we can kind of play with some mind games here.
We talked about previously, Red Bull have 20 to 30 seconds up their sleeve each race. So they have the opportunity to take some risks. They have the opportunity to play games a little bit. So why not do it?
I still think seeing Sainz at the top means that Ferrari has something that is competitive. I think this is where it's exciting to see. Again, what's going to be, is that actually that time very competitive to what then Red Bull then comes out, it goes, it does? Or are we very much 5 seconds off the pace, 10 seconds off the pace when that Red Bull actually comes out on track and does a full qualifying lap? Will be very interesting to see. And my last thing I think that came out of testing was has topped the lap mileage, doing 450 laps over those 3 days. Now, again, it's up to the teams what they wanted to do and what circumstance they're actually going to be running over those 3 days. But it's very interesting to see that I think Haas went for longer race stints. They wanted just to really understand on how this car is going to perform when it comes to a race, when they're doing those 50 or so laps, rather than just trying to play around with, okay, how do we learn about qualifying? How do we learn about different sprint formats, etc.? How do we learn about maybe how much low fuel can we actually run this car on? I think they're in a bit of a pickle and understanding how the car is going to run in that longer period of a race, which just only raises a bit more eyebrows on, do they even have a car to lift them from the bottom?
And I think, like you said, they didn't really focus on things like qualifying sprints and getting qualifying laps in. They weren't anywhere near being the fastest lap. So it's possible that they kind of went, you know what, we're going to qualify towards the back of the grid. We're aware of that. We understand that. What we can possibly do is try for longer stints, aim for one-stop strategies at as many races as possible, and save ourselves that 20-odd seconds of having an extra pit stop in each race. And that potentially brings them up into that midfield where there are other teams that will have to make 2 pit stops in their race strategy.
Yeah, well, we'll see. And I think that's the interesting thing. Like, testing is one element, but there is just so many smoke and mirrors. Bring on this week's Grand Prix.
On that note, coming up, we do have the season opener at Bahrain, first race weekend of the season. Watching Drive to Survive this week has really gotten me excited to get back into the swing of regular qualifying, sprint and Grand Prix weekends.
Yeah, it's so close now. It's very exciting.
You can almost taste it. Plus, as an added bonus, later this week, we'll be releasing a bonus episode of Let's Talk called Small Talk, where we'll be each providing a couple of our own personal predictions for this season before the cars hit the track on the weekend.
Yes, we will. So definitely tune in for that later this week. That's it from us today. Don't forget to subscribe to Let's Talk wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And as always, while you're there, give us a rating. Also, jump onto our social media and give us a follow at Let's Talk Show and let us know your opinion on Drive to Survive this season and what your predictions for 2024 will be. Thanks for tuning into today, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk.
Let's Talk is hosted, produced, and edited by Shaun Polidano and Aaron Best. Our show is an entertainment podcast, and the views expressed by the host and guests are meant for entertainment purposes only. Let's Talk is recorded in Bahrain in Naarm, Melbourne, and we would like to acknowledge the Burrarong people of the East Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land, and pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging.